Today we're going to look at some of the promises of autonomy and recognize that it's haunted by the brittleness problem. It's illustrated simply with a autonomous vehicle, a drone, that was unable to adapt to changing circumstances. And a problem in the software led it to act in a way that was perfectly consistent with its model of the world. However, it wasn't. Luckily, this one only involved damage to the aircraft and to a few people's reputation. So our plan today, the overarching story we're going to be looking at, is that there are complexity penalties that arise whenever we develop and deploy new technology into risky. And these complexity penalties limit performance. And they increase risk because they increase the brittleness. Brittleness is excess, and it's in the wrong place given the operation and the other signals that are coming. And we've illustrated this in many examples. Current methods for developing and deploying our new technology, such as autonomous capabilities, doesn't address these complexity penalties. It does provide new capabilities, but the way those are taken advantage of by people in various roles, right, produces these kinds of complexity. Now, the good news is new advances in science about adaptive systems, from biology, from joint cognitive systems, even with human social systems, can lead to pragmatic systems engineering processes that can help us outmaneuver these complexity penalties. And that's what we're going to try to talk about. But this story of how we outmaneuver complexity, we are all players within the story. We all contribute to it. But we all bring limited models and bounded perspectives to the process. So what's the fundamental finding from all this work? That you have a surprising sudden collapse in performance. But it occurs puzzlingly and against a backdrop of continuous improvement. We deploy new capabilities, we get new indications, new services we provide of value to different kinds of customers and stakeholders. But this was captured around 2000 in a variety of works. This is one from Gene Carlson and John Doyle, right, where we've discovered that systems can be robust to perturbations they were designed to handle, yet fragile or brittle to unexpected ones and design. So they're highly competent when events fall within the envelope of design for uncertainties and variations, but sudden large breakdowns occur in the face of events that challenge or go beyond the boundaries of that. In this, right, we have a basic finding and even a theorem in Robust Yet Fragile from Doyle and others, that the pursuit of optimality alone increases brittleness of the system. So this is the basic pattern. And one of the approaches to understand and explain this and develop ways to act is the discovery of graceful extensibility and the accompanying theory that explains a variety of constraints about adaptive scales. There is another comprehensive theory emerging recently from Doyle and many of his colleagues called diversity-enabled sweet spot. So we've got at least two that are moving forward to help us understand these phenomena. Now, what does this have to do with autonomy, though? So attempts to deploy autonomy into these risky, complex worlds are hampered by brittleness. We've been seeing this. Our first studies identifying this was with the AI technologies of the 80s, right? And we published a variety of studies about the brittleness problems with those systems. Now, descriptively, brittleness is very simple. We all really understand it, right? Because it's a kind of sudden collapse in performance when events challenge system boundaries. It's a boundary effect, right? How fast does performance roll off when an event challenges the boundaries or limits of a particular system, right? And this is separate from how well it performs far from the boundary, right? That's going to matter, as we'll see in a little bit. Now, over my 4 decades of dealing with this, each cycle of technology says brittleness only exists in the past. Right? They downplay it as a fundamental issue on the grounds that the next advance in AI, algorithms, control theory will lead to the deployment of systems that escape from brittle limits. Yet, right? The world continues to provide new cases of brittle collapse. We can look at some that started resilience engineering, like accidents in NASA space exploration, the Columbia Space Shuttle disaster. We can look at them with more traditional forms of automation that we give autonomy and delegate authority to, such as the Boeing 737 MAX accidents with the MCAS system only a couple years ago. Or even this year, February's Texas energy system collapse. Right? The issues of brittleness keep occurring in ways that we should be understanding and changing our patterns for developing and deploying capabilities. We could go on with case after case in financial industry, cloud computing, airline systems, airlines going down and losing hundreds of millions of dollars. These viability crushing events, or the events that may be viability crushing to the ongoing livelihood of that organization and its activity space, or as safety events that harm and kill people. We could go on and on. So what's the point? Very simple. Brittleness is a fundamental risk. All truly adaptive systems in the biological world, and we're part of the biological world, human systems are part of the biological world. All the adaptive systems in the biological world develop means to mitigate that risk. It's fundamental, right? This is what the discovery. All adaptive systems at all scales have to possess the capacity for graceful extensibility. Right? Viability in the long run of a system requires the ability to gracefully extend or stretch at the boundaries as challenges occur. And challenges will keep occurring. Ironically, as we'll see, in part because you deploy valuable services through your new capabilities, which does what? It triggers other stakeholders in related roles to adapt, to take advantage of those capabilities, asking systems to do more, do it in more complex ways, with greater independencies and at new scales. Simply put, viability requires extensibility. This is a hard constraint on all systems. Right? This is the discovery. This is the constraint that matters. And how do we take that into account and utilize it in pragmatic systems engineering? Right? Now, this constraint is universal because finite resources. That means all systems have limits. When we produce things, however much it's the latest technology, there's trade-offs in the personnel, the schedule, the budget, right? The work it takes to get new venture investments, the initial examples. We're constantly making assumptions. We're making trade-offs. It's standard in systems engineering. It's part of the handbook process. So we will experience surprise at the boundaries given continuous change, right, and those finite resources. What does this have to do with autonomy? The development of automata consistently ignores this constraint. Pretends it doesn't exist. And what do we get? Repeated demonstrations of brittle collapse. Now, we've got, and you as an audience can appreciate this from a control point of view. In particular, designers can violate the constraints on adaptive systems, just like designers can build a bad control system for the context and disturbances that play out and the variability in that world. But their systems cannot escape the consequences of violating constraints. The result is we continually deploy autonomous capabilities in a way that produces excess brittleness in all the roles. Right? Systems as designed are more brittle than stakeholders realize, but fail less often because there's an ad hoc source of graceful extensibility floating around. It's called people. Right? As a biological system and as part of the biological world, some people in some roles adapt to fill the shortfalls and stretch system performance in the face of smaller and larger surprises. Right? They're the ad hoc source of the necessary graceful extensibility. So our real system, when we deploy autonomous capabilities, is that capability which does not exhibit graceful extensibility, plus some human roles provisioned in some ways to act as to add graceful extensibility and stretch at the boundaries. And this is what we observe and find when we study joint systems for the last 40 years. We see it over and over and over again. That's not what this talk is about. Our talk is about the implications of this new constraint. So what's our storyline? The science highlights paths to build systems with graceful extensibility, right? In particular, systems that have new autonomous capabilities. No machines so far possess graceful extensibility. All biological systems, including people and human systems, possess some. Now, we can have, in case of human systems, where we fail to provision it, or we undermine the sources of how people demonstrate or add graceful extensibility. So there can be downsides. We can lose it. We can undermine it. It can be inappropriate. And of course, we can see this in a variety of kinds of settings, whether it's beyond surge capacity events in emergency medicine due to mass casualty events, accidents, or other kinds of. We see it a lot in the response to the pandemic as well. Designing systems with graceful extensibility actually draws on control engineering, as we'll see a little later. Right? So that has a history, and a history that goes back to 1950. Norbert Wiener, right, warning us about the dangers of literal-minded machines. We have a variety of findings. If we think about them in a new way, by combining them with how some of these biological systems demonstrate graceful extensibility, as well as when we see graceful extensibility in action from joint human technology systems. Now we're going to illustrate this with some recent outages in critical digital services. Why critical digital services? Because they represent layered networks, right? And as Doyle and others would claim, our topic here is layered networks or architectures for layered networks, organized complexity. And these networks demonstrate high autonomy and high authority. We delegate a lot of authority to the algorithms to act on their own when trouble arises. Our point is machines, while they don't currently demonstrate any graceful extensibility, which matters a lot, they could be designed to possess some graceful extensibility. The problem is no one tries. So the goal of the talk is really simple: to recruit you, to build teams, and we've got to solicit a little funding along the way. We've got to have some resources, right? If we can get provision with resources and build the right team, we can try. And I'm trying to illustrate this in the case that there are real possibilities for making this work for many kinds of systems at many scales. And this can have a dramatic impact on our facilitating our ability to deploy autonomous capabilities to have the positive effects, but not the offsetting consequences from the risk of brittle collapse. And then we'll review some of the key ideas about how we can do that practically. Now, to start this, we've got to back up. Everybody likes their definitions, right? And those usually generate fights. We've been fighting over what resilience means, and there's myriads upon myriads of ways to talk about it. But the key thing to remember about what we're going through is adaptive capacity, right? That systems have to be poised to adapt in a changing world, where even if you're well adapted to the variability and opportunities in that environment, the world will change. Right? And when it changes, you need to be prepared to defend or take advantage of those changes. So adaptive capacity is a system's readiness or potential to change how it currently works, to change its models, to change its plans, to change its processes, to change its behaviors, to continue to fit changing situations, anomalies, and surprises. Right? So it's not how well your model is fit or how well it captures the world now. It's not how well your model captures the world now compared to previous models. Hey, I beat the last two. Right? What matters is your ability to revise that model when new evidence comes in that the world is changing in ways that challenge the boundaries and limits of it as a model or a plan or an algorithm or whatever. This means surprise. Events that surprise are not about frequency of occurrence, but they are surprises because they challenge the model on which you've developed your automata, plans, procedures, etc. They're model surprise. Responding to the potential for model surprise requires preparatory investments. This is about the potential for adaptive action in the future. Right? Adaptive capacity is future-oriented. It's about the future, a readiness to revise and a readiness to respond in advance of the challenges at the boundaries. So if you take an emergency department, right, its ability to respond to a patient surge, right, has to be built in advance of the experience of a particular surge in patients. When you have a mass casualty event, and it goes beyond the limits on that emergency department, right? How do people deploy their capabilities? How do they mobilize new capabilities? How do they, right, generate new capabilities of the process of demonstrating a capacity for graceful extensibility, to extend the level of performance. In fact, one of the best cases, if you want to read some of the literature, is to look at emergency departments for understanding the processes of adaptation, potential for future adaptive action, and graceful extensibility in action. Right? What does this mean for you as engineers? We keep forgetting something. Systems can be competent, for example. And the cases we're going to run through are systems who have very, very strong availability statistics. And brittle. They can be competent and brittle. In fact, that, as we'll see in a moment, we'll illustrate with a little animation. Right? You are both competent and subject to the risk of brittleness. And that's why we need to add in graceful extensibility to offset that risk. So graceful extensibility is this positive capability to stretch near and beyond the boundaries when surprise occurs. It's the opposite of brittleness, and it trades off with the pursuit of optimality. We see it because we study places where surprise is tangible, like emergency medicine, like intensive care units, other like space operations, places where surprise is tangible and the experience of it is occurs often enough and is significant enough that everyone understands and has a connection to that event and what it means for your operational world. And the name is a very simple combination of two classics, right? Graceful degradation, but that only refers to being less negative in our performance under stress, right? And the other in software is software extensibility. When we design software systems, especially when they provide valuable services, we know they need to be designed in now to extend their performance, to extend their capabilities as they get asked to do new things and new relationships, interacting with new software, being provisioned through new means, running on new kinds of hardware, et cetera, et cetera. So let's illustrate what this means. When you look at the world through the lens of your algorithm, the lens of your automata, the lens of your AI algorithm, the lens of your plan or procedures, we're just going to call that the plan. When you look out, it's always springtime. The trees are always green, the flowers are always blooming, right? The plan is going to work better than previously. It's going to work effectively. It takes things into account. If I knew there were things I didn't take into account, I would have taken them into account, of course. How many times have we heard that, right? So you try to take all these things into account to build out a way for the system to work, right? And be competent at handling variabilities and achieving the goals of stakeholders. But what actually goes on is outside the boundaries of that planful activity, there's a threat. The dragons of surprise come up, and there are dragon tamers out there trying to keep them from burning down your forest and roasting all the flowers. Right? These are two things going on. Now, when we look at the people doing the taming the dragons of surprise, they're looking back at those developers and managers admiring their plan, going, hey, I could use a little help over here. Right? There's these exceptions, anomalies, and surprises that are occurring, and they're occurring regularly. They're not zero and then once in a while happen. No, they're happening as part of the regular flow of activity. But they're being handled, right? And that handling by people, right, is a demonstration of graceful extensibility. So take a very successful software company who provide software to provision critical digital services that then provision financial, airline, all kinds of different organizations. On the left, we have a map of their interdependencies. It becomes a spaghetti diagram as they grow. On the right, we have an example of their growth and projected future growth as a company. They're going to have more traffic, more stakeholders, more customers, more relationships over time. What we're referring to, again, and partly as we said at the beginning, the complexity penalties emerge as a result of success, which produces growth. Right? And that's a network with extensive and hidden interdependencies. Right? People in different roles will pursue advantage, right? Changing, extending, scaling up, right? To gain advantage from the new capabilities and valuable services you develop. Inevitably, brittleness and complexities emerge, and then other people adapt to fill the gaps, work around the bottlenecks, stretch performance as they experience new kinds of anomalies, surprises, and exceptions. Right? They're showing the necessary addition of graceful extensibility. So what do we got? Competent yet brittle, tangled layered networks under pressure. Graceful extensibility is a necessary but undervalued component. Autonomy developed without trying to build any of the extensibility, giving you excess brittleness in the wrong places. So the question for today is, can we design and deploy automata with graceful extensibility? So let's examine something in the transition zone. In the transition zone. Right? Think of this like in archaeology, anthropology. We're digging up fossils and we're looking for transitional fossils on the way from early, from primates into hominids into Homo sapiens or something. We get all excited about a transitional fossil bones and what that means for how we make the transition. Only here, we're looking into the future. And we're saying, right, because we're all saying, hey, look at the future when we deploy all this autonomy and all the great things are going to happen. Well, the future is already here, and it's not as advertised. And you can see that future in how we keep these critical digital services working, and how sometimes outages are threatened but managed, and how sometimes it goes so far as to actually have an outage of that valued service. And again, it's a high autonomy, high authority, layered network. So our transitional zone examples are 2 Slack outages. Slack, something we all rely on, especially more so now, or a similar service like Slack, as a mechanism to interact during the pandemic as we move to more distributed and non-co-located forms of work and coordination. They had 2 outages late last year and early this year, so they're recent ones. I've done an amalgam, right, which is lossy because it's only based on the public sources, and I did the amalgam because each incident illustrates part of our story about how we get and lose graceful extensibility. So our background. Slack emerges, and by the way, if you know the story of Slack, it was an accident. It was actually a gaming company was being started. And in order to control their software and work together as a team, they built some software on the side relative to help them develop and push their gaming platform out to the potential customers and stakeholders. Well, the game disappeared, but the tool they built for developing the game persevered as Slack. So it initially started with Amazon Cloud Services, AWS, one account, one virtual private cloud, right? That was a great infrastructure for to build its capabilities on. But the customer base grew, tools evolved, more services, more infrastructure, right? Slack owned some, Amazon owned other parts. Forms of saturation appeared. Saturation. I go back to that animation, right? What happened, right, is disturbances arise which challenge the limits, right? So think of it as a continuous control problem. We start to saturate our ability to act in the face of those changes. We run out of capacity to continue to maneuver in the face of those events, right? Well, saturation is a basic concept in control engineering. It's in the textbooks. Well, we'll come back and revisit that in a minute, because now we're going to interpret it in a different way, or a more expansive way, more properly. So as these forms of saturation emerge, you get rate-limiting stuff on the Amazon side, you get problems arising in the cognitive costs. Some of those are related to the business aspects of growth. Some were related to simply keeping track of how this increasingly complex system even works, and partly because of the multi-party scopes of responsibility interacting. So they adapt. They gained more resources. Well, again, some of that was from the Amazon side. That led to even more overlapping between the different parties, more interdependencies across different scopes. More growth occurred, more saturation appeared. You hear things about the load on the network engineers, a nightmare to manage, how it was fragile, where small issues could spawn large troubles that threatened outages. The admin overhead rose, all of which contradicted what upper management thought would be, as we matured, all this should get cheaper, all this should get smoother, all this should get less important. Again, new rounds of adaptation happened, grabbing more capabilities, increasing the complexity. The tangles in the layered network kept growing. Right? So let's look at essentially what happens. We're going to go through it in more detail. There's a triggering event, right, which turns out to be crossing, in one of these cases, the two scopes of responsibility. So on Sunday, it's the lowest usage of Slack. Monday morning, what does everybody do whose work depends on Slack? They get on to look messages, send messages, what's going on, and updating. So the transition from Sunday night to Monday morning is the highest, is the strong transient on this, right? Big transient. Well, Slack has designed this to work across this transient, to handle that challenge. Right? Over time, the Amazon side, right, given the way it was set up and made changes to serve, given the level of service that Slack paid for, right, the gateways on its side couldn't handle it. It couldn't keep up with the rate of requests. And that started, as that component, functional component, saturated, the saturation started to cascade and spread and affect other parts of the system. Much later in the process, you see it here with the web tier, a little cartoon to illustrate. Too many servers, too many open files, trying to provision too many things, too many calls. This happened in the systems trying to respond, right, to compensate for saturation in some place. Right? And that led to other points of saturation in the system, which led to other things trying to respond to saturation, which interacted with the degraded network capabilities, right? Which meant it was trying to do things, all of which put more overhead on an already degraded network. So the lessons are, we saw behavior of the functional components change at saturation, idling units, latency increases, dropping tasks. We saw working at cross purposes between different components trying to adapt, either because it was saturated or because it was trying to respond to saturation somewhere. Misplaced local adaptations for both provisioning and deprovisioning resources to different actors. It was very difficult to see behavior near or at saturation by any monitoring capabilities, especially for the people. The automated compensation helped. The system kept working for customers, even in degraded performance, for quite a while. But it also hid what was going on. It was hard to understand the pattern of saturation and what kinds of effects and responses that was triggering and how those were spreading through the network. The strange loop behavior. Right? There were two examples in these incidents. Right? On the Amazon side, there were too many instances of some resources, so they deprovisioned them, which cut off some of the sessions the incident responders were running trying to diagnose what was going on. People were critical in the final analysis to pull everything together and resolve the situation. And afterwards, right, what's the most common expression reflecting on what happened? I didn't know it worked Right? What does this all illustrate? It illustrates that despite all our efforts, or actually because of all our efforts to build capabilities to provide valued services, systems are messy. Some people provide, or that's resilient performance, that source of graceful extensibility that's essential for systems to succeed despite their design. Right? Finite resources, change, pressures, snafus like these are normal all the time. In fact, Slack has lots of incidents. The difference in these two was they actually affected customers. Usually incidents that threaten outages are solved before there is any serious customer consequence. But they happen.
Whether looking through lenses of chemistry, biology, or sociology, more elaborate things build up through the combining of existing things, resulting in hierarchies of organizing. In an article titled Graceful Extensibility, David Woods calls these self-organizing hierarchies tangled, layered networks, a label that highlights their messiness, providing a contrast to the neat taxonomies and org charts we often use to describe them.
All right, but what does this have to do with automata? Well, did these people, remember I said it was a transitional example? Did these people design and deploy automata with graceful extensibility? Well, actually, in a way, they did. Right? As opposed to if we looked at the aircraft automation, the drones, there's no graceful extensibility there at all. But I didn't choose to give you those examples. I gave you this one because, in a sense, they're kind of trying. Right? Behaviors at saturation are designed. They choose how these functional components will act as they approach saturation. Some of these are protective. And without them, the system might fail harder under certain conditions. Examples are storm protection. A storm is where everyone tries to act, to utilize the services at the same time because of patterns in human activity. Some add robustness. There's panic modes. They call it a hammer threshold, where they can rapidly ramp up resources when a storm is coming. Circuit breakers, retries. There's all kinds of ways they're using algorithms to try to manage and add robustness in the face of the variability in order to spread load around. I mean, load balancers, right? They literally do, right? What do? Try to avoid saturation. But when events combine in a way, or where they misunderstand how their system works as a result of changes due to growth, and we start to get saturation, as in these cases, there's not a cause by one of the events that triggered a saturated component. Rather, right, the saturated component triggered other things which put more saturation in other places, which ultimately led to the loss of service. There isn't a single failure. There isn't a thing that failed, right? It's an emergent system property from the interactions across the components and situations. So what did we end up with, though? Them struggling to make this work, and in fact, having to add these things to make these services work. They're incoherent and ad hoc, right? The different kinds of behaviors across in the face of saturation. They're late. They occur very late in developing situations. They're weakly synchronized across the different units at the different levels in the network. And then there's some hard constraints that are difficult, such as the strange loops. Right? And they're just hard to deal with. And we keep finding them when we look at incidents in critical services, even when we don't go look. So the key here is that graceful extensibility can guide coherent design. Right? And that takes us back to the theory. Right? What are the fundamentals? So let's just run through, right, as we go through this, a couple of those fundamentals. Brittleness is never zero. You can't make brittleness zero. It's always present due to finite resources, pressure for optimality. As John Doyle likes to say, you have excess fragility. Right? It can't be zero, but you can have a lot more than you have to have. And we can do a lot of actions which bump that up unnecessarily. It also can be in the wrong place. And this gets us into the dynamic nature of these systems to start to understand and see the emerging signs that, wait a minute, We thought we were worried about brittleness over here, and maybe we've been very successful at managing this specific source. But all of a sudden the signs are coming from somewhere else, that there's a different place where we have to worry about this. So again, it's how do you change? Remember being poised to adapt. How do you change what you were doing previously in the face of new evidence? Now, graceful extensibility has to be there. Some has to be there to be considered an adaptive unit. So most of the design of autonomous capabilities has 0. However, there's another constraint, which is you can't have enough graceful extensibility by yourself. Whatever unit you're analyzing at whatever level, it has to have some, but it can't have enough by itself. And the reason for that is really simple, which is the same constraints that create the need for graceful extensibility apply to what provisions graceful extensibility. Right? Finite resources and change. So you have to have some, but you need more. We demonstrate this very nicely in our studies of beyond surge capacity in emergency medicine. When these events occur, how mobilization and generation of new capabilities and how those are then deployed into the evolving, changing situation in order to have to have the right effects. In these cases, to take care of the injured, ill patients. Right? So back to our fundamental hard constraint: viability requires extensibility. Where and how are we going to get it? All right. Well, it's built into biology because of some of the aspects of genotype-phenotype relationships and how gene transfers work over generations. Biology has worked out an architecture that does that. And we have many examples in biology that biology can select for future adaptive capacity, despite the fact that sounds paradoxical or impossible. Biology can select for future adaptive capacity, even though it doesn't know what that future will value as adaptive capacity. Now, because we see this also in human systems, it's been demonstrated at different levels. Now, human systems, because we're not governed by genetic transfers, all right, cultural evolution, we end up with we can demonstrate it, we often don't demonstrate it, right? We can go both ways. So from the successful cases and from biology, we know some of the constraints. What helps you demonstrate graceful extensibility and what helps you lose it. The question is now, can we use that knowledge in engineering systems, especially with autonomy? So how do we do that? First, right, we recognize that no matter what kind of unit we create or engineer, it has a finite range of adaptive behavior. Whatever scale we want to model the system at, it has a finite range of adaptive behavior. Capacity for maneuver is a general parameter. Right? You can think of that as the positive version of risk of saturation. Right? Risk of saturation is fundamental. Right? Again, the textbooks have saturation in them, but they treat them as a correction for characteristics of physical sensors and actuators. Instead, we think of it now as a constraint on any kind of control, any kind of adaptive system. It can run out of the capacity to maneuver in the face of upcoming and future challenges. Right? As demands increase, you can use up all of your capacity to act. This is easy to understand with a control system like on an airplane, where we have a fixed limit to how far the control surface can move. It just physically can't go any further. We can run out of the capacity for maneuver. Right? So we have the positive version, or we can say the negative version, of controlling the risk of saturation or ensuring that we preserve some degree of capacity for maneuver for upcoming demand. So as risk of saturation increases, we can act, or capacity for maneuver starts to approach saturation, we can start acting earlier. Remember in our examples, they acted too late. We can use this to develop new kinds of signals that lead to behaviors that adapt and deal with the risk of saturation, mitigate that risk earlier and more effectively, extending the range of performance. Graceful extensibility in action. Right? We can look at it in designing how we mobilize and deploy, or even sometimes have to generate new capabilities and insert them into an ongoing situation. We can see that and time that. How do you do it timely in sync with the tempo of operations? So if we think through the tempo of operations, we can again work out better policies, right? And of course, that's what the designers call in the Slack world and critical digital service world. A lot of the way they design these algorithms is to implement different policies. So we can come up with other kinds of policies that are more effective when we think through this process of how we're going to mobilize and deploy extra resources. So we've got a single parameter we can use everywhere and add it to, not replace, add it to the way we build our control mechanism to make complex systems work. So capacity for maneuver operationalizes the potential for future adaptive action, risk of saturation, operationalize brittleness in an actionable form, right? Because we can act before failure, right? The classic descriptive view of brittleness is a destructive testing view. How do you know you're brittle? After you've collapsed. Now you've already had the cost of that collapse, that penalty, that cost, that injury. Like the sports player. Hey, how'd you know you overstressed your knee when you tore your ACL? Oh, now I know not to do that. Well, sorry, you're out for a year. Right? That's the penalty. Right? That's the loss on viability that ensues in that fundamental constraint. Now, these apply to a unit in a network. It applies to a collection of units in a network, a region, a neighborhood in the network. We can do it at different levels. There's fixed and elastic limits. The fixed is nice in engineering, makes it a little easier. Biology and human systems, it's elastic limits. And we've demonstrated some of this in fixed limits with our colleagues, Anu and Amir. I can't pronounce the last name correctly, Farjadian, who've done some great work inspired by this idea of controlling the capacity for maneuver and illustrated it in some nice classic aviation control problems. So let's tie this all together in a way that may be relevant to control people. Let's go all the way back. We mentioned Norbert Wiener in 1950. How about Ashby in 1956? Ashby in 1956 puts forward the law of requisite variety. Only variety can destroy variety, says in the book. It's great, right? People have used this all the time conceptually, right? We've moved way past it in math. What does graceful extensibility say and revise about this? Well, there's a new law in town. The requisite revision of Ashby. Right? Think of it as the law of future adaptive capacity. Only the ability to revise past answers to what is requisite variety can produce future requisite variety. Right? I hope I have indicated there is a path forward. Automata are brittle. You can't wish it away. You can't make it go away by the next algorithmic advance. We can attack the brittleness problem. We actually understand a fair amount about it, and we have a variety of mechanisms that are highlighted in the theory of graceful extensibility, right? And there's other developments happening, as I mentioned, from Doyle and his colleagues. There's other capabilities coming forward on the science side that we can translate into good systems engineering approaches to take advantage of the new capabilities to better serve human purposes and stakeholders. Thank you very much.